Welcome to Harvard Business Publishing's How I Teach podcast, where educators share their insights and approaches on teaching important business topics. I'm your host, Mark Ranella. Now that we're deep into the COVID-19 era, we'll also be including some questions that look into how this pandemic has or hasn't had an impact on business instructors, their courses, and the institutions where they teach. Today's topic is crisis management, a skill that has historically been given relatively little attention in management training. But in the midst of our current outbreak of seismic cultural, political, and health predicaments, the ability for organizations to deal with crises will be increasingly sought after. It's obvious that we need to cultivate strong leadership that has the capability to manage during these moments. What's the best way to train leaders for the emerging uncertainties that lie ahead? This training relates both to major problems that originate externally from an organization, generally known as disaster management, and those that originate from within, which falls under crisis management. Each requires sophisticated training to supply executives with the tools and the perspectives to deal with decision-making under significant pressures. Today, our focus is crisis management. I'm delighted to have as a guest today Professor Mary Waller, who's M.J. Neely Professor of Management at the Neely School of Business, TCU, in Fort Worth, Texas. She's taught courses on crisis management, managing team dynamics, organizational behavior, introduction to management, and organizational theory. Professor Waller, thanks so much for taking the time to speak about this important topic.
My pleasure to be here.
Great. Okay. Well, let's start with you. Could you tell us about your background and especially how it led up to your interest in team dynamics and crisis management?
Sure. I was a late bloomer coming to academics. I spent about a decade in industry. I started out working in oil and gas as a petroleum landman. I was going to school at night. I got a Master's of Science degree in information systems. So I moved from oil and gas to software development management. And during that decade, working in oil and gas and software development, it seemed like I was always working in a team of people, working under time pressure, working in some kind of crisis situation, usually of the organization's own making. And so after that decade, when I decided to go back to school and get a PhD, it seemed sort of like a natural progression to study team dynamics in critical situations. So that's kind of how that all transpired. And then at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my PhD, I met Bob Helmreich, who did tremendous work in aviation psychology. And I ended up doing my dissertation research with aviation crews and a full motion flight simulator. And so a lot of my research then was done with looking at flight crews and nuclear power plant control room crews, underground mine research or mine rescue teams, teams like emergency department, trauma teams, those types of teams as they deal with critical situations.
Oh, that's a fascinating topic. It really is. And so interesting how you just were digging deeper towards there through your whole career.
Pretty much a one-trick pony. Yeah.
Well, it's an important trick. So getting back to crisis management, what do you like teaching about crisis management, its rewards and challenges in the classroom?
Well, I think one of the big challenges is that crisis management as a topic sort of rarely appears in management textbooks for whatever reason, and organization behavior textbooks. And so it's really kind of struggled as a discipline, as a topic, to make its way into mainstream management and kind of find its place in terms of legitimate topics, in business schools. That might change, I think, with the pandemic. But the great thing about teaching crisis management, I think, is that it's a very, very sort of practical application of a lot of our organizational behavior and organizational theory ideas and principles in a particular domain. So we can take pieces of organizational behavior, pieces of organization theory, and put them in this domain and really see them work in a particular context. And that's really exciting. And it really gives students, and particularly more advanced students, I love teaching crisis management with students who already have some practical experience in organizations. It really gives them a way to see, oh gosh, the stuff that we talk about really does actually work. That's pretty exciting.
Could you see it as part of any discipline? I remember I had a previous podcast talking about cybersecurity, and the professor was bringing up the case that, when a cybersecurity thing happens, you can apply this to every part of the organization. Is that the same here?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, an individual responds to a crisis situation. We know that there are team level responses. We know, for instance, contagion, at the team level. We know that there are team level responses to crisis situations, and we certainly know that there are organizational level responses to crisis situations, and they all impact each other. They all fit together like pieces to a puzzle.
Right, and it's not like a crisis won't happen, right? They always do.
Right.
So it's interesting how you're saying it just should be in your intro course. You have a section on crisis management because that's just part of what organizations deal with.
Exactly. I think in the past, there have been these stances regarding crisis management. First of all, lower level students don't need to know about crisis management because that's something that the C-suite and the board are going to deal with. And we don't need to, bother undergraduate students with this type of stuff. Well, undergraduate students do need to know that this kind of stuff is going on because it's certainly going to impact them. Crisis management is something that we're going to farm out to a consultant. So we really don't need to be taking up class time with something like crisis management when that's something that a PR firm is going to deal with for us, and we know that that's an inadequate response. So these types of responses just don't hold water anymore.
Is there anything you're learning about crisis management that's you didn't see as clearly before our current health crisis?
Well, that a lot more people are interested in it now, just based on the number of phone calls and emails I've been getting recently. I think a lot more organizations are interested in business continuity now, which is probably a really good thing. They probably don't have the bandwidth right now to devote a lot of time and energy to it right now, but I think they're saying, when we do have the bandwidth, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year, we've got to be ready for the next one. And that's a good thing.
Right. You brought up in a previous communication with me, to be cognizant of the difference between crisis management and disaster management. Could you bring up the salient points that people should know about, the salient differences?
Yeah, I developed my course when I worked at the Schulich School of Business at York University, and York has a wonderful program in disaster management outside the business school. And the people in the disaster management program were the ones who really helped me develop an understanding of the difference between crisis management as it existed in the management department in the business school and disaster management, because they really did have different training, and it was is a different discipline. It involves working with public institutions. It involves crises like a pandemic or like a natural disaster that are much longer lived than a lot of the crises that business organizations typically deal with. They deal with crises that are not self-inflicted typically. They deal with crises that are universally affecting a wide range of organizations simultaneously. So you're kind of all in the same boat. You're competing for the same resources during the crisis. And those are qualitatively different situations than the crises that organizations deal with individually, like a product recall, like executive malfeasance, like the typical crises that we want our graduates who will find themselves in the C-suite or near C-suite situations to be ready to deal with.
So just thinking about your own immediate environment, I'm curious about how, say, your colleagues or your school or your department is dealing with this crisis right now. Any interesting things going on?
Yeah, I mean, well, the organization as a whole, the university, just like every other university, is engaging in their organizational business continuity plans, trying to figure out, okay, what's the best strategy to employ for the fall semester and ongoing. And so that's kind of unfolding day by day, trying to look at resources and figure out what the best plan for everyone is. But in addition to that, I think what I really appreciate about the Neely School is that, like everybody else, we've moved to having virtual department meetings, virtual faculty staff meetings where you have 100 people online at the same time, and you virtually raise your hand, and you miss seeing people and communicating face to face and everything. But what I really appreciate is the Neely School taking the extra step and really making an effort to do things like having virtual bingo games, and carving out a little bit of time and effort and energy to have virtual time together that is just fun time. We're not talking about work, and we're going to meet and we're just going to be silly together. We're just going to have fun together because we just need some time together to blow off some steam. And that has been so nice.
You might want to call that human continuity
right.
in this crisis situation.
Exactly. And at the Neely School, we do such a good job of celebrating with each other. I think it's really part of the culture.
Well, that's unanticipated, but now that you mention it, seems extremely important part of navigating a big crisis like this, keeping our human connections. So it reminds me of that apocryphal quote from Winston Churchill when they asked him, why are you funding the arts right now during World War II? And he says, well, what are we fighting for? It's like, if not for this.
Exactly. We have to be able to keep our culture intact, and our culture is high touch. We take such pride in knowing our students and having a personal relationship, personal professional relationship with our students, and it's hard to do that online. And we care deeply about each other. It's hard to do that, electronically, but we're doing our best.
Getting back to the teaching of crisis management, I'm just wondering if you could give us a general description of the course you teach on it, maybe what its central focus is and what students should know by the end of it.
Sure. I love the article by Pearson and Claire. Well, I really let that guide me. But
what's the title of that?
Crisis Management.
Crisis Management. Okay, by Pearson and that's right.
Pearson and Claire, AMR.
Mm-hmm.
But they had this wonderful model in that article, and we kind of walked through that model from left to right during the progression of the course, and it really starts out looking at the orientation of top management in the organization, the cognition of the top management as it pertains to crisis management, and walks through to the point that a crisis actually occurs, and then the aftermath of that event in terms of how teams might respond, how individuals might respond, and then the outcome. And so we talk about that progression at sort of every stage of the game. But really how I structure the course is talking about crisis management, like I said before, at the individual level, the team level, and the organization level. And then we put the the pieces together. What I really want students to be able to do at the end of the course is to go into a crisis situation, be able to identify the type of crisis that they're in, and let the type of crisis guide them in terms of the strategic actions they should take. And then we really key on situational crisis communication theory in terms of the type of crisis communication they should engage in. So those two things, the crisis type, and we really rely on Lehrbenger's identification of crisis type and the strategic actions that line up with crisis type. And then Tim Coombs' situational crisis communication theory in terms of the strategic communication that they should be engaging in, and then which stakeholders at which times should they be talking to.
I imagine that something you might have to think about is to make sure that the students really assess a particular situation thoroughly and not come to it with a preconceived formula or framework beforehand. Do you find that that's an issue?
Absolutely. And so if I put students in a situation of, okay, imagine you're the top management team of this organization, this has happened, and then you have this crisis coming at you, how would you respond? Before they learn about crisis types and strategic actions, how the public is likely to respond. We talk a lot about attribution theory. They give me one set of answers. And then after they learn about the strategic responses, attribution theory, how the public is likely to see certain actions, and we look at lots and lots and lots of real examples. And the sad thing is, I have tons of real examples that I can bring into the class and show them, here's what the organization did in this situation. Here's how the public responded. Why do you think this happened? And then bump it against the theory. And I can show them, here's what the theory said would happen. Here's what actually happened. Look, the theory actually works, right? I have tons of examples to show that, yeah, this stuff really does work. And then at the end of the course, we do a real-time crisis management simulation that lets them try it out on their own. And they usually do pretty well.
That's great. And just wondering, from all these great discussions and case situations you bring up, do you have one or two memorable moments in class, a super aha moment that the class just loved, or a surprise that occurred?
The most exciting things usually happen during that crisis management simulation at the end. They're usually nervous. They don't know what the crisis is going to be. They've gotten information about the organization that they're managing. They play the role of the top management team. They get a lot of background information about the organization, and then they meet. They know that there's going to be a crisis. The crisis unfolds. They talk about, okay, what crisis type is this? What should we be doing? They engage in those actions, and they're getting real-time emails and tweets from angry investors, and the press wants to know stuff, and customers want to know stuff, and they're responding to these people. And at the end of the simulation, they usually kind of gasp for air, and they say it's stressful. But the greatest thing is, at the end of the simulation, they kind of lean back and high five each other, and they're relieved, but they're proud of themselves that they, God, we really did learn something here. We really did learn something, and we have a new capability that we didn't have 8 weeks ago. And I think that's a big revelation. That makes it all worth it.
Yeah, I can't imagine a more satisfying end for a teacher.
Yeah.
For them, see all their, proverbial light bulbs going on at the end of that exercise.
Exactly.
So you mentioned as well in our previous communication that your course became asynchronous online. So I'm just wondering, any big takeaways for you about either the differences between teaching in class and online in an asynchronous manner, or maybe some things you've learned about teaching asynchronously that you would bring to this the next time?
Yeah, I think I made the choice to go asynchronous because of the situation that my students were in. They had all these demands on them, and I wanted to make the course as flexible as possible for them. So I did a module a week. I had my slides, and I did a video a week, a video voiceover of my slides, one a week, so they could watch that at any time during the week that they wanted to. They had assignments with deadlines associated with them each week. So they had to get that done each week. But anytime they wanted to watch the video, they could. So, if they were homeschooling and they wanted to watch the video at midnight, they could. If they wanted to watch it at 6 o'clock in the morning, they could. And I really tried to minimize the amount of teamwork stuff that I did. Usually when we meet face to face, I have team exercises that I do in class, and it really is a high touch class with a lot of interaction. And so I had to find a way to work around that. But I really wanted to make it as flexible as I could for them in their situation right now. I kind of wish that I had worked in a little more discussion board stuff in there for them. I'm not sure they would have taken advantage of it. I did have one open discussion period and nobody took advantage of it.
Right. Well, maybe they're used to it. Who knows?
Yeah. So I didn't know quite how to interpret that. But they just didn't need it. Their plates were so full.
So you mentioned how great it was to see them finish the simulation. So I imagine they didn't do that this semester. Did you have a substitute for that?
No, the simulation was the one thing that we did synchronously. We did it one team at a time, and we did it with Zoom. So they did two things synchronously. They met as a team to discuss their crisis management plan. And each team put together a plan for this fictitious organization that they played the top management team for that role. And then the next week, we did the crisis management simulation. They met, it was about 90 minutes long via Zoom, and I watched them on Zoom go through the crisis management simulation. And I recorded them as they went through the crisis management simulation so I could watch their simulation later and provide them debrief feedback. So the next week, every team got some debrief feedback on that. And I took all the text that they generated, all the emails that they generated as a team that went back to those characters that were sending them emails during the simulation. I took all the text that each team generated and I fed it through linguistic inquiry and word count to measure the emotional tone of what the team generated, and did a little quantitative analysis to compare the team's emotional tone and showed that to them. And it was interesting because it really did line up with the strategies that the teams chose.
So have they generally been appreciative of this asynchronous option?
Yeah, I asked them afterwards if they wished that we had done something more synchronously, and a few of them said, well, maybe once at the beginning, but otherwise it was fine, and that they did really appreciate having the flexibility. The flexibility was really, really nice.
And was there any use of the current pandemic in your class?
I did refer to it several times, but it was sort of like trying to hit a moving target. In terms of how the pandemic was being managed, it was a moving target. And even if I had wanted to use it as an example, that would have been difficult.
Any anticipation of how you're going to teach this the next time? Now that you've gone through this change? I mean, of course, there's all sorts of, unknown factors like, are you going to have a blended class? Will you see these people or whatever? But I'm just wondering, any thoughts right now about how you might change how you've taught this compared to, say, 2-3 years ago?
I think I would, if we go to blended, I would start out with face-to-face first. and then maybe move to asynchronous with some kind of chat function or something like that, maybe.
Mhm.
But the asynchronous worked pretty well. To tell you the truth, everything worked pretty well. I couldn't be happier, really, with the output of the students. Their crisis management plans were right on target. Their performance in the crisis management simulation was really good. And I'm comparing them with the face-to-face classes that I've taught in the past. I really don't have any regrets about that.
It's interesting. Other professors I've talked to about other disciplines, they often say, I use stuff in the news to bring into class so I can get people to start talking, or I'll bring in a YouTube video that was made last month about XYZ so they can start talking. So that's why I was thinking, oh, you've got this pandemic, that is well, maybe it's a disaster and not so much a crisis, but,
Right.
there's some things to learn from that, but I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm thinking, is it too big and sprawling to use right now?
I think it's too, it's almost like, COVID overload. It's just too much. Plus, for my course, and I made this clear in the very first video I think that I made for the course. In my course, I focus mainly on event-based crises.
Mhm.
And so we're focusing mainly on the crises like management misconduct or product recalls or things like that, sort of traditional, if you can think of them that way, um, organizational crises
Mhm.
that they're likely to see. Even crises like hacking, where there's been some kind of attack against the organization. But the widespread disaster type thing is really a different animal that really requires a focus on business continuity.
Mhm.
And I would love to teach business continuity, but I need another 8 weeks to do that.
I'm just thinking, what are fundamentals of crisis management that never change in a way? Like crises are, each one has its own fingerprint, right? Pretty
Mm,
much.
yeah,
But as far as my, light acquaintance with the literature, it seems that there are tried and true ways to approach a lot of these. So I'm just wondering, what are in general some of the things that don't change in crisis management?
well, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about that. And that's part of the problem with crisis management.
Mm.
Everyone has their own special sauce and their own special recipe, and that makes it difficult for organizations, that reach out. And there are a lot of purveyors of the fundamentals
Mm.
of crisis management. Um,
Sort of
and
innovation in a way. Innovation has a million flavors, and people are selling lots of different kinds of
Exactly.
innovation. Yeah.
Exactly. In my course, like I said, being able to recognize the crisis type, the fundamentals of the type of crisis that you're dealing with, um, and being able to let that crisis type drive a set of action strategies that you take, and those action strategies have actually empirical research behind them, letting the research suggest to us what the best actions to take are versus some other source
Right. Right.
that we might choose, and then paying attention to things like Tim Coombs' research on situational crisis communication to suggest to us how best to explain to people inside and outside the organization what we're doing.
I'm curious, what's the best case study or moment? What's one of your favorite, you know, uh, things to delve into that seems very rich or very easy or interesting for students to get involved in?
A case study that I use is a film that is on PBS. It was produced by Frontline and ProPublica on the BP Deepwater Horizon crisis.
Right.
And to me, it's a great example of how organizational culture can kind of perpetuate an organization's proclivity to be crisis prone. And it kind of brings home a lot of the things that we cover in the course in one organization. It's a great example, unfortunately. So the students watch that film, and it's a great sort of video case study.
Excellent. I really appreciate this. You had a lot of great insights.
That is great, and thank you. It was fun.